So welcome again. Today we are having this panel discussion on GMO labeling, the changing political landscape. My name is Brett Nadrich. I'm the editor of foodpolicy.us. Foodpolicy.us is a multimedia platform designed to foster a broad-based dialogue about our food system. We try to address challenges in making our food healthier and more sustainable primarily. And our core mission, like our motto, is to cultivate dialogue and grow a movement. Our events cover a wide range of topics and structures, such as panels, lectures, dinner gatherings, pop-up restaurants, and many others. We are headquartered in downtown Washington, D.C., which allows us to ground our policy focus in the culture of our nation's capital. This event has been brought to you by a variety of partners, co-sponsored by the Biotechnology Industry Organization, the Environmental Working Group, the Georgetown Culture and Politics Program, and the Georgetown Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program. And it's being filmed for later web distribution, so make sure to check our website in a couple of weeks to watch the videos. Can we get a round of applause for all of our sponsors, please? I'd also like to thank everyone involved in today's program. First, our distinguished panelists, Dr. Cathleen Enright from Bio, and Scott Faber from the Environmental Working Group. Our moderator, Dr. Tim Beach, Dean Maura Gregory and Ben Zimmerman from the Culture and Politics Program, the GU Food Studies Group, and all the Georgetown faculty and staff who have made today possible, Sticky Fingers Sweets and Eats for supplying the amazing cookies in the back, and all of my colleagues at foodpolicy.us. Thank you to all of you. As a reminder, please join us for our next event, which will be this summer at the Washington, D.C. campus of New York University. It'll be a panel on the topic of reforming U.S. food aid to developing countries. Check our website for more info over the coming weeks. And as always, please don't forget to sign up for our mailing list in the back, where you picked up your programs. At this point, I'd like to introduce our distinguished moderator and panelists, starting with our moderator, Dr. Tim Beach. Dr. Tim Beach holds the Cinco Hermanos Chair in Environment and International Affairs and is Professor of Geography and Geoscience at Georgetown University. He is the director of Georgetown's program in Science, Technology, and International Affairs, and the former head of its Center for the Environment. As you'll see from your program, he's also the recipient of awards and honors too numerous to mention. And now for our panelists, Dr. Cathleen Enright. Dr. Cathleen Enright is the Executive Vice President of the Food and Agriculture section of the Biotechnology Industry Organization. Her extensive career prior to joining Bio includes leading the Governmental Affairs Office at the Western Growers Produce Association, serving as Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative, and particularly important in this context, negotiating the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. Scott Faber is the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Environmental Working Group. Before joining EWG, Scott was Vice President of Federal Affairs at the Grocery Manufacturers Association, where he spearheaded efforts to enact the Food Safety Modernization Act. Scott also helped shape the 2002 and 2008 Farm Bills, while acting as Food and Farm Policy Campaign Coordinator for the Environmental Defense Fund. Thank you, and without further ado, Tim Beach.
We would first start off with a little introduction by both of our panelists here today. I wanted to also issue my thanks for both of them to come and to the Food Policy Institute for running this very interesting, important topic on GMO labeling. I think that as I introduce this, I'm going to say just a few words over 3 minutes here or so, and then move on to our panelists, and then we'll move on to a group of questions, many of which were supplied by students and faculty members here, and then we'll move into a time where there'll be open questions as well. I was going to start off by saying that at this point in time we have plenty of food in the world, but our world food supply is dependent upon a number of breakthroughs from the 20th century Green Revolution in plant breeding and hybridization, which continue on and which required massive inputs of resources, but also applied good ecology as well, often which we forget. 1,000 scientists played significant roles in developing the Green Revolution breakthroughs and yields, none more significant roles, none more important than Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts towards these ends, and whose name is part of the building that I got my PhD in at the University of Minnesota years ago. So I always mention him after that. These breakthroughs are not without their critics, of course. and uneven successes as well. We also know that the world population continues to grow, adding 2 to 3 billion more people during the 21st century. This will require a lot more food and better transportation of that food, and much of that's going to come from surpluses based on abundant fossil fuel resources expended over short time spans from the hard labors of millions of years of solar radiation that we're tapping at this point. We need more food and we can grow it, but at multiple costs. To more long-stored solar radiation, to environmental externalities, and more science and technology applied to agriculture in the international arena. One technology that can help this is modern extension of the 6-decade history of the Green Revolution, genetically engineered crops. But some argue that these come at cost of health, and more likely at cost of nature. Today we examine this debate through the lens of labeling food items or resource items as GMOs or GMO-free. This is obviously a philosophical question, and we have philosophers here who can help us with this, and one that must be founded in what the best science can tell us. And today we have 2 respected thinkers who represent different views of this debate. The stakes for farming are high. Enough food for 9 to 10 billion people, sustainable food production, non-renewable resources, environmental impacts that could jeopardize our long-term sustainability. I come to moderate this debate as a student of soil agriculture ecology and the history of plant domestication in 2 of the world's agricultural hearths, Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica. And my own studies have put me in the heart of studying those basic food crops of corn and cassava and fruit trees and so forth. So those of us close to this thread of the agricultural revolution that made all other revolutions possible value the basic resources that made civilization possible. We also know that resistance occurs in populations and that there is a long history of supposedly win-win chemicals and exotic introductions becoming lose-lose propositions for the future. So now I want to move to Cathleen Enright for her introductory statement. Thank you.
So I'll be very brief. I'm Cathleen Enright. I have a PhD in biochemistry, and when I was a scientist at Johns Hopkins University, I was genetically engineering in the lab. So I'm fortunate to have ended up at Bio. I came to Bio about 14 months ago because I get to work on a technology I believe in, technology I've seen, as the result of which I've seen the benefits accrue around the world. And I'm actually thrilled to be here. This is the first time ever that Bio has participated in a discussion on GE labeling. I will call it GM, GE, biotech. They're different, but for this discussion, it's the same thing. So if I jump back and forth, forgive me. I'm talking about GMOs, genetic modification, genetic engineering, biotech. But as you'll hear in the conversation today, we as an industry have not done a very good job in the last 15 years talking about what we do. We've been busy doing other things. We've been not communicating. And so when Brett first came to me, our folks said, oh, we've never done this before. We've never sat across from our adversary. And by the way, I know Scott Faber for years, so he's only a little bit of an adversary. But it was time, it is time for us to change that approach, and so I'm really pleased to be here, and I hope that I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have.
Great, thank you. My name is Scott Faber. I'm the Vice President for Government Affairs for the Environmental Working Group. And for those of you who don't know EWG, we're the nation's leading environmental health research and advocacy organization. We work on a lot of issues that are probably close to home, literally in your home. We are fighting for better regulation of chemicals in consumer products. We're fighting for better regulation of chemicals in your food. We're the lead organization in Washington advocating for better farm policy, in particular doing more to reward good stewardship of our farmland and limits on some of the subsidies that flow to the largest and most successful farmers. We do a lot of work on fracking and do many other things that you would expect a group based in Washington to do, but one of the things that makes EWG unique, and one of the reasons I left my job as the Vice President for Government Affairs for the Grocery Manufacturers Association, which represents all of the terrific packaged food companies that are in your pantry, was that EWG also really believes that consumers are ultimately going to help change the marketplace and help put more sustainable products in your pantry. And to that end, we produce a series of guides that are on our website, ewg.org, that rank all sorts of consumer products, cleaning products, personal care products, and food products to help you decide what are the best choices to make for your families. We know you're busy. We know it's hard to sift through the ingredient statements and all of the toxicology and make those choices, so we've hired toxicologists to help do that for you. In addition to being the Vice President of Government Affairs for EWG, I wear 3 other hats. One is I help run the National Just Label It campaign, and Katie Parker, my colleague, is here. She also helps us manage Just Label It. Just Label It is really a coalition of more than 600 organizations, environmental organizations, consumer groups, public health groups, farm groups, religious groups, Tea Party organizations. I mean, it's one of the, labeling is a fascinating issue, in part because it's one of the few issues about which virtually every American agrees, except apparently for Cathleen, but we'll get to that. The other hat I wear is I also help run an organization, a new C4 organization called Food Policy Action. And a number of us in the food and environmental advocacy world decided that it was time to hold members of Congress accountable for their votes on food policy. And so we've created the first food policy scorecard. You can go to foodpolicyaction.org to see how your legislators voted. And we score members of Congress based on how they voted, how they vote on issues like labeling, hunger issues, nutrition issues, obesity issues, farm subsidy issues, and so on. And we have a great board that includes the CEOs of not just EWG, but Bread for the World, Oxfam, Center for Science and the Public Interest, Top Chef Tom Colicchio, Stonyfield Farm Chairman Gary Hirschberg, and many others who spent their lives fighting for better food policy. So, and then my 4th hat is I'm the commissioner of the Cap City Little League, which means I need to leave exactly at 6 o'clock so that I can throw out the first pitch. So why don't I stop there?
Okay, good. Well, I thought we would start off with a broad issue first and then move into some specifics later on. And so I thought I'd start off with one of the questions the students asked me is, why is genetically modified organism labeling such a divisive issue? Why has this issue become so prominent? And I'd start off with Kathy.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's become an emotional issue for a number of reasons. The folks who oppose biotechnology, they've been advocating from their platform for 30 years. But with the advent of the internet and social media, their voices are echoing and people are listening and paying attention. In addition, folks in the United States have become, thanks to shows like Top Chef and other cable channels having to do with food, folks are really interested now in what they eat. My European friends say, what is this on the shelf? What do you mean you don't go to the grocery store every day? Now we are asking those same, we have those same interests that our European colleagues, for example, have. So I think the confluence of those 2 things has enabled people to learn about food technologies, or at least genetic engineering, and they're asking questions and they're taking sides. And I'm hoping that at the end of today, by answering your questions, whatever question you have, that at least you'll leave here with a better understanding of genetic engineering. And then, of course, you can choose for yourself whether you want to become a campaigner for us, or you want to not. You want to be a campaigner for Scott.
Well, Scott.
So I think we're in the midst of a really fascinating period when it comes to food. We're in an era of what I would call sort of a period of unlimited food democracy, where people feel entitled to know what they're eating, what they're feeding their families. And it's almost as simple to say, but people want to know a lot more about their food. They don't want to know less about their food. They want to know what's in their food. They want to know who made their food. They want to know where their food was made. That's a dramatic change that we've all seen just in the last decade or so. And it's a great development, in part because so many of the choices we make about our food have dramatic impacts on our health, and have dramatic impacts on the environment around us, have dramatic impacts on the how we treat animals, have dramatic impacts on the livelihood of food and farm workers. And so what's so exciting about these issues is that for the first time, I think, in our history, and it's been now, what, 13,000 years since we sort of sat down, got a PhD in soil science, so I don't know the answer to that. It's in that period of when agriculture really began, it's really the first time where consumers have really begun to vote with their forks, have really begun to use their power to make choices that in turn not only shape their own health, but shape the world around them. And so I think in general, GE labeling fits into that broader trend of demanding to know more about our food. I think specifically why GE labeling has become such a kind of a political issue this year is because of the fight in California, and I know we'll get to that. But I think in particular the way industry conducted its campaign to defeat a ballot initiative in California ignited a sort of sense of outrage among people who care about food around the country, that some of the claims that were made, some of the steps that were taken in California to defeat Prop 37, a ballot initiative that was narrowly defeated, has really changed the landscape of the debate around GE labeling. So now instead of seeing one state and one ballot initiative, this year there are now 26 states and counting that are debating GE labeling legislation or will have GE labeling on their ballots. And it's sort of just, and I really do attribute it largely to how industry conducted itself, and then ultimately the ability for people to know about how industry conducted itself in California.
So may I just add something to that? So this is our third year of food labeling issues in states. In 2011, 2012, there were 36 of them. The only reason that we know about it is because of California. I find Scott's assertion about the way industry conducted itself quite interesting. In California, what we envisioned, and we're going to talk about labeling, I hope, in a minute, we felt that what we were seeing from proponent groups was really a scare tactic campaign, right, in California. California, it was Prop 37. It was, would mandate, if it had passed, the labeling of genetically modified food, some genetically modified food. There were a lot of exemptions. And it would have enabled trial lawyers to go after folks if they asserted that there was non-compliance with the law. Well, that impacts the entire food chain. In the United States, we know that if food is dangerous, it's not on the market. If food is unhealthful, if it raises a concern about food safety, you know it because it's labeled. That's why we have mandatory labeling. If you're allergic to peanuts, the food is labeled so that you can avoid an allergic reaction. And so what we saw was essentially an assault, if you will, on the food industry. Farmers, we were under siege because our crops, our seeds that my members produce, were being accused of being in some manner unhealthful. Farmers were being subjected to red tape, or could have been if the law had passed, if they were caught up in a lawsuit. Again, the lawyers in California, it was really interesting legislation, could have just asserted that Scott did not comply with the law, and then Scott had to hire an attorney, could go through discovery, might just settle. Farmers would have been subjected to that, processors would have been subjected to that, grocery stores would have been subjected to that. California had already been through this exact same legislation category in Prop 65. You all are too young to know about Prop 65. I am not too young to know about Prop 65. Prop 65 was legislation written by the same attorney, by the way, as Prop 37 was. And it basically said that if anything could be carcinogenic, you have to label it. So if you go to California, those labels are everywhere. But what the trial lawyers did was they brought suit against folks who didn't label. They've made tens of millions of dollars on that practice. So for us, this was not about food labeling. This was an attack on the U.S. food supply. And again, we were opposing bad policy. We were opposing a mandatory label that would assert that there was something different or unsafe about genetically modified foods. There isn't. And we were protecting our customers in the supply chain, or working to protect them from spurious lawsuits. So I'm not really sure what tactics you're talking about.
Well, I'll give you an example. Sure. Thanks for it. And we should let Tim back in
No,
here.
that's all right. I was going to get back to you after that.
One good example is that industry, and I can't say whether this was Bio or another organization, the organization that was funded to fight Prop 37, I know Bio did support that, and bio companies did, was making the case that simply requiring a may contain statement or some kind of statement to alert consumers to the presence of genetically engineered ingredients would increase the cost of food by, I think it was $400 a year. $400 a year. And I can tell you, having worked and represented the food industry for 5 years, that, and you all know this intuitively, that food companies are constantly changing their labels in order to attract your attention. And the refresh cycle, as we would have called it in the food industry, is typically less than a year, sometimes maybe 2 years at most. So the notion that adding a few words to the back of a label would somehow balloon the cost of buying food was really hard to sustain. And in fact, Emory University professor did a study which showed that, in fact, the obvious was obvious, that simply changing a label in the course of a refresh cycle to say this product may contain genetically engineered ingredients, or somehow indicate, not include a health warning, but somehow indicate to consumers who are looking for that information that a packaged food might contain GE ingredients, would be a trivial cost that wouldn't show up as a price at retail. But I think, yeah, and I think Cathleen, I think it probably makes sense to get back to sort of the core issues, which is, do people have a right to know? Why do they want to know? What role does Congress play? What role does the FDA play? And I don't want to take over your moderator.
No, those are,
we're doing such a great job without you.
All questions that are on the list here, and that's the next question. Do people have a right to know?
Well, I think you clearly, and this is a complicated issue, right? So people don't have a right in the sense that the 14th Amendment guarantees them a right. Proud graduate of Georgetown Law School. But there is, under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, a requirement that products not be deceptive, that labels have to be truthful and not misleading. And when you really dig into the weeds of what does it mean for a product to be truthful and not misleading, what the law says and what FDA lawyers will tell you is that the absence of a material fact, such as the inclusion of GE ingredients, ultimately makes the product misbranded. It makes the product deceptive. And so in that sense, consumers do have a legal right, because the 1938 law guarantees them the right, that products are sold in a way that aren't deceptive. And this has been, in some form or another, the law of the land since snake oil salesmen traveled west on the stagecoaches, right? And it's always been the role of, in this century in particular, the FDA, to make sure that what you're being told about the product is truthful and not misleading, that you're getting what you've bargained for. I think the other kind of way to think about this is we know a lot about our food because FDA has compelled companies to tell us what's in our food. So, and we know things about our food that arguably are a lot less important to us than whether or not our food contains genetically engineered ingredients. So we know how much sugar, fat, and sodium's in our food. We know how many calories is in our food. We know whether there's high fructose corn syrup in our food. We know whether there are chemical food additives in our food. We know whether our orange juice is from concentrate. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that whether or not our food contains GE ingredients is more important, is material to more people than whether or not their orange juice is from concentrate. And we know all those things. Well, at least one person wants to know. I want to know if my orange juice is from concentrate. And so in a sense, so to answer your question, Tim, the law requires that the FDA law requires that food manufacturers tell us these facts about our food. And so, and very clearly, FDA has the authority to tell companies like Kraft, Conagra, Coke, Pepsi, and so on, to provide this information. So really at that point, it becomes a question for the Obama administration, whether or not to use that authority to give us the information that 93% of us tell us